Alright, folks, welcome back. So, following Wallace's miraculous recovery or resurrection, depending on how you want to look at it, he has returned to his family at Rickerton, and all the Wallaces and the Crawfords and all of the friends and close family members are all flocking around Wallace, and he's about to begin his career as the man and the legend and the war hero that, he is generally known as and is celebrated as. This is the very beginning of, like I said at the end of the last video, the rise of Wallace, his ascension to the great hero, the patriot, the commander, the general. Wallace was very much a general. He's described actually by James Mackay in his book as being a general, and I would say that's a fair assessment. In fact, it reminds me of a quote I heard from Napoleon, something like, "No, there should be no general over the age of 40," or something like that. Well, Wallace never gets to 40. I'm probably misquoting it, but the point is, like, Napoleon always asserted that generals should be young. They shouldn't be old. They should be young men. Should be the ones in charge, which is very interesting because it's very unconventional when you compare it to modern, military doctrine and logic and all this sort of thing. Like, generals are like in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and Napoleon said no, the generals should be young. And when you look at the career of Wallace, you can't help but think he had a point. But anyway, I don't know how we got onto Napoleon. So this is the Battle of Loudon Hill. Now, I'm not totally sure what year this took place. It is generally believed to have been in 1297, and I thought that as well. But now I lean more towards it taking place actually in 1296. Anyway, it was run about then. So let's get into the chapter. In the bright sunshine of the month of July, the flowers gave off their perfume in the summer heat. The countryside was in full bloom, and the woodland animals engaged in their seasonal pastimes. High in the air there was birdsong, and fish swam and splashed in the streams and rivers, all of nature watched over by God. God's provision was in abundance, and yet while Scots were reduced to famine in these days, Englishmen wanted for nothing. By cartload they brought food to their places, stuffing their homes with wine and fine foods. And right away you're seeing how the English have set themselves up for a fall because they've gotten too comfortable. Claiming Scotland as their own, they ruled the kingdom with a will of iron. Messengers then brought news to Percy that Wallace was alive. Of his escape from Ayr prison, they swore that it seemed to be true. They suspected Wallace was responsible for the deaths of Lancaster and his yeomen. Percy agreed with this view and was disturbed by this turn of events, indicating that the prophecies concerning Wallace could yet prove to be true. Well, Lord Percy, if you hadn't been so casual, so laid back when those two knights came up to you, when Wallace, killed the three knights who tried to steal the fish off him, you could have nipped all this in the bud right back then. This is partly your fault, Lord Percy. Henry Percy was his name. In fact, it is largely his fault. He's completely mismanaged this situation, and he doesn't have good control over his men, or any, it would seem like. He's not a good commander. He's not a good captain, I don't think. I don't get that impression. But he's not totally without some good features. Like, he seems to have his head screwed on right. I think Lord Percy's kind of like better in the role of an advisor or a counsellor rather than somebody who should be put in charge of an outpost or a town or something like that. I mean, there are different roles within any sort of occupation. Some people are better advisors, some are better politicians, some are better ambassadors, some are better commanders. Lord Percy is the kind of guy who should be an advisor, in my opinion, and you'll see why. But he's not the kind of guy who should be in charge of, well, anything, except maybe administration or bureaucracy or taxes or something. But he's not the kind of guy you should put in charge of soldiers, in my opinion. So, excuse me. So Lord Percy spoke woefully. And this is what I mean when I say he would have been a better advisor. You know, some people are better as number twos. You know, and by number twos, I don't mean like pieces of. I mean like better as being like second in command or lower down the chain. But this is what he says: Who needs more evidence? If he is not stopped, he will do us great harm. It would be to King Edward's advantage if he were to make Wallace his ally. If the king should grant him gold or land, we may secure his loyalty. That may well prove a less costly act, I think, than trying to take him by force. Wise men all agree that this prophecy of Wallace may explain his escape. So you see what I mean? Like, Percy has his head screwed on right. He's reading the situation very precisely. And this is almost like a prophecy within and of itself. You know, he's talking about a prophecy, but he's also kind of making one, because what Lord Percy is predicting here is, well, of course it's true. I mean, we know that Scotland wins the War of Independence. Well, wins both of them, but, you know, it's largely through Wallace that the Scots achieved this victory because of his lasting legacy and his great deeds. And, you know, for hundreds of years, the Scots, you know, the second most popular book in Scotland was Henry the Minstrel after the Bible. You know, that's according to some sources, according to this book, in fact. But we'll get to that, I'm sure, at some point. Percy and his men continue to discuss Wallace at length. We leave them here and speak further of Wallace. He would no longer abide in Riccarton, no matter the advice of friends who put forward many arguments for doing so. So if he was resurrected and brought back, then his stubbornness certainly hasn't abated any. They realised it was useless. William would not be swayed from his own course. If there's ever one sentence that summons up his character, it's pretty much that one. His purpose was to enact revenge against those who had slain his father and brother. They listened as William outlined his plans. Sir Richard had 3 sons, Adam, Richard, and Simon, who were all daring and bold. Adam, the eldest, was growing into manhood. He was 18 years old, fair complexioned, forthright, large, intelligent, trustworthy, and brave. Bruce, in his time, made him a knight. Years later, in Bruce's wars, he fought in many battles against Englishmen. This brave young man proposed to ride with Wallace and 3 of his closest companions. These were Robert Boyd, we got a little bit history of his clan at the end of the last video, who could no longer live under English domination, Cleland, a near cousin to William, who later shared with Wallace many perilous adventures, and Edward Little, William's sister's son, for whom Wallace had great affection. And once again, we don't get really anything about Wallace's sisters. They just totally kind of drop from the story, you know, but at least we're getting one of his nephews here, like his, you know, one of his sister's children is in the story at least. They put on their shining armour and with their men rode to Mauchline Moor, where they stayed only a short time, while their and with hang on, I'm getting lost here. Where they stood only a short while, bringing provisions for. Sorry, this is. I've lost my place here. Okay, but they stayed only for a short while. Okay, they had learned that an English supply wagon was coming from Carlisle, bringing provisions for the garrison at Ayr. The man in charge of the supply train was called Fenwick. He had been responsible for the deaths of William's father and brother. The news that Fenwick commanded the supply train pleased Wallace immensely, and the men were now a full merry company. So how Wallace learns about this? Well, he must have spies in his service. He must have recruited locals to go and gather information for him. I mean, it is talked about in this book that he had like a whole supply network. Spy network, I should even say. Well, supply network too, I would imagine. But, you know, he worked out a signal system with like horn blasts and like that sort of thing, you know. It was quite sophisticated, and you can imagine there wouldn't be any shortage of volunteers given his miraculous resurrection to help Wallace. I mean, that must have given him a pretty, you know, pretty high position. Like, you know, they'd be looking at, this is the man who survived death, you know, to go on and fight the English. They had him, and they could have killed him, and they should have killed him, and perhaps even they did kill him. Depends on how you look at it, but this is the man who slipped through their fingers, so he's taken on this kind of legendary status, already. And he's not even won a battle yet. Well, he's about to. Wallace and his men rode towards Loudon. They camped at the forest near the town, for it was nearly nightfall, and watched the road intently. Master Blair informs us that a loyal Scot who owned an inn nearby, just under Loudon Hill, had seen Wallace and his men arrive. Later that night, this man came to their encampment, bringing them meat and drink in plenty. He told Wallace that Fenwick could not be too far away, as he had seen Fenwick's 2 advanced riders gallop towards Ayr. They guessed that Fenwick would probably be crossing the lands of Annandale by now. Wallace then issued a command: "We will not sleep tonight. Lay your armour and weapons aside, but remain fully dressed, I at the ready." From that time onward, Wallace and his men, during their campaigns, adopted the habit of always remaining clothed wherever they rested. He wore good, sure clothes daily. A light sleeveless coat of mail lay under his gown, and a steel cap lined under his bonnet. In his jacket he wore a steel collar, and on his forearms plate covered in cloth. Forearms armour plate even covered in cloth. His face was mostly always bare of armour, as were his 2 large hands. When aroused in anger and giving chase, there was no man living that could outrun him. So large was he in muscle and strength, his terrible blows were awful to endure. The men trusted more in Wallace alone than in any dozen valiant men together. The Scots did not rest that night. They moved past Loudon Hill in the grey light of dawn, chose their place, then tethered their horses some distance away. They built a dry stone wall on a part of the road to narrow it, and when this was done, all the men knelt down to pray. They prayed to God above with all their might, and with humble hearts, to help them in their righteous cause. When they finished their prayers, they donned their armour. With faith in God, none of that company was worried. Then Wallace spoke. "This is where my father was slain, and my brother too, a thing that gives me much pain. So I will die today or be revenged. The traitor who comes here was the cause of their deaths." After this, they concealed themselves, waiting, bonded as one. And, it's worth emphasizing that most of the men who are with Wallace are either friends of the family, friends of him personally, or relations. Some of them, like, distant relations, like cousins, things like that. But, well, like second cousins and things. But, Wallace is gathering a following slowly but surely, and they have complete confidence in him because, I know, broken record, but like I said, this is the man who's beat death. Even death would not stop Wallace from taking his revenge, and you can imagine psychologically that would have a big impact, that would have a big resonance, and Wallace the Deathless, getting names like that, the man who cheated death, and it's kind of like that show I watched, Spartacus, who made that show again? Was it HBO or something? I can't remember, but it's like the bringer of rain, and stuff like that. These kind of titles and monikers, they kind of stick to people, and it kind of builds up their reputation and things like that. It kind of reminds me a little bit of that. Like, you can just imagine all the kind of nicknames that Wallace would have enjoyed. Fenwick led the company as it approached Loudon Hill. He had striven many times for England against Scotland. The sun was in the ascendant on this bright summer morning as the English force reached the brow of the hill. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is July 1296. Fenwick caught sight of Wallace and his men and gave forth a bellicose yell. "Yonder is Wallace, who escaped from our prison. He shall be drawn through the town once more. His severed head would please our liege lord Edward more than gold or anything of this earth." Fenwick commanded the servants to stay by the carriages. With his 180 cavalrymen, he thought he could easily overcome this ragged band. Wallace stood alongside his 50, every one of them believing their cause was just. The stone wall they had built disrupted the first charge of the cavalry, throwing the riders into confusion. The Scots stood unflinching before them. This angered the English, who, in their pride, had believed the Scots would be easily overcome. Suddenly, to their surprise, the Scots attacked, sprinting forward armed with spears. They unhorsed many, piercing armour to inflict wounds. Wallace hurled his spear with such force at the foremost rider that it penetrated the man's armour and drove through his body. Again, this emphasis that it was such a blow that it actually went through the armour, not just that all weapons cut through armour like knives through butter. It had to have some force behind it to go through the armour. But this is, again, emphasising the Herculean physique that Wallace enjoys. The spear's wooden shaft sheared into splinters when it met the resistance of chainmail. Case in point. He then drew out his long, heavy, sharp sword. The clash of steel resounded on all sides as the English tried to regain some formation, still hoping they could ride down the Scots. The Scots, displaying great agility, remained on their feet in this great press of men and horse flesh. Their swords pierced the coats of mail and blood showered onto the ground. No English soldier was spared. Those wounded were put to the sword as insurance they would never in the future play a part in the subjugation of Scotland. Such valour in battle had seldom been seen in so few. Together they stayed united in defence of their land. That's very important, remain in formation. I mean, you see it in the movie Gladiator, where he's saying, stay together and stay in the columns and form up and all this. It's the same kind of a deal, but on a much larger scale. But, the idea of staying as a rock, staying in unison, not breaking, holding your nerve, holding your resolve in the face of all this pressure, and it's just a case of the Scots holding their nerve and the English nerve, being broken by the fact that the Scots are unflinching in the face of all this, and that they've cleverly erected these walls, these kind of makeshift barricades to nullify their advantage of being on a horse. None dared waver in the face of their foes. Fenwick, in a rage, rode forward throwing a spear. Wallace caught sight of him and ran in his direction, hacking down all opponents who tried to come between him and his quarry. As Fenwick rode past, Wallace chopped off his right leg, high on the thigh just below his buttock. Fenwick instantly toppled from the saddle, landing on the ground on the opposite side of the horse to Wallace. Wallace longed to deliver the death blow, but Boyd skewered Fenwick immediately he landed. Before Fenwick had breathed his last, a thick press of Englishmen knocked Boyd to the floor. Wallace hurried to his rescue, his blade swiping the English aside, and brought him to his feet. Wallace had sustained a sword wound and was in great pain, but he valiantly battled on. All the Scots fought bravely. The enemy persevered in their assault, but continued to fall to the Scots. Adam Wallace struck down a fighter of renown, the English knight Beaumont. His flailing sword ripped open the knight's belly, spewing his entrails onto the floor. Some Englishmen stayed, nobly fighting to the last, while others departed the field. And there's a footnote here. Adam Wallace was not only William's full cousin, but also the full cousin of Robert the Bruce. Very interesting character. And I like the fact that Henry the Minstrel's saying here that some of the English, continued to fight, even though it was a losing battle, the momentum had totally shifted over to the side of the Scots. They probably knew they were going to die, but they refused to give in. They refused to run away. Some of them did, some of them stayed and fought. So anyone who's saying that Henry the Minstrel was biased against the English, xenophobic, blah, 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 well, you have to answer for this, because he's saying that not all the English ran away. Some of them, stood and fought to the death, and they knew they were going to die. They knew it was over. They knew that they were not going to leave the field alive. But such was their honour that they would not turn their back. They would not run away. They would go down fighting, It was a very real thing. Chivalry, honour, that sort of thing back then, it was very important. So I like that. I like that not all the English are conniving and cowardly and all this sort of thing. Lord Percy's got his head screwed on right. He's not the right kind of material to be a commander, but he's a pretty smart guy. Men have different talents, but here you're seeing that even though Fenwick is killed, went down pretty horribly, his men are still standing strong. They're not leaving. Most of Fenwick's men were slain, although 80 had escaped. 3 Scots, 2 from Cunningham and 1 from Kyle, lay dead. When the battle died away, the Scots gathered the spoils of the wagon train. Wallace ordered Fenwick's servants to drive the carts to the Clydewood. When they reached the forest, the Scots hung all those who were capable of fighting, as a warning to all Englishmen that some Scots were no longer prepared to stand aside as their country was overrun by agents of a foreign king. Women, children, old men, and priests were left unharmed and sent on their way. That's always the case with Wallace. He never harms the innocent. I put that in one of the other videos I made about Wallace, like the top 5 things about Wallace. He never harmed the innocent. Those English soldiers who had fled the field hurried to the castle in Ayr. They told Percy all that had happened. Percy listened intently, then spoke. If Wallace is allowed to continue, he will overthrow our governance of Scotland. Our jailers were slovenly in their work when they allowed his escape from our prison. Conveying our supplies by road is now too risky a business. We shall have to bring them by sea. This unfortunate loss of our men distresses me, besides damaging our prestige. Our people may regret that they ever set foot on Scottish soil. So yeah, Wallace. Percy really sums up the situation pretty magnificently here, actually. I mean, this is a pretty, like I said, he's a pretty intelligent guy. He's also got foresight as well as insight. Wallace is going to be a massive problem. Wallace is not just a minor headache who's going to go away. This is a problem now that we've created ourselves and we're going to have to deal with. Wallace, if he gets enough support and wins enough battles and victories, which he will, is going to, expel us from the land. And the fact that he's advising as well, bring the supplies in by sea now and stop using the roads across country. This shows tremendous kind of understanding of logistical difficulties. Like a stupider or more stubborn man would have said, double down the convoys, put twice as many soldiers in the supply trains, something like that. But Percy just says, you can forget about taking supplies over land now. That's all over with. We need to do it by sea where they can't reach us, which is pretty smart. I have to admit, well, Lord Percy has his head screwed on right. There's no doubt about that. He's the kind of guy who is better as the advisor to the captain rather than being the captain. But, I don't think this is the first time, and I don't think it's going to be the last that, men are put in charge of things that they just shouldn't be put in charge of. I'm sure that happens under every sort of military occupation that's ever happened in the history of the world, so it's not surprising. But anyway, be sure to leave your thoughts and comments below.